everybody who is joining us. We are going to get started here in just 1 minute. Welcome, everyone, to our webinar, Strengthening Virtual Exchange, AFS's Preliminary Research Results, co-hosted by AFS Intercultural and the Stevens Initiative. And happy International Education Week. Before we begin, I would like to note that this webinar is being recorded and that the participants are on mute. The Q&A is open, so at any time throughout the presentation, you can add questions and comments, and we will be sure to reserve time at the end to address them. We are also live streaming this to our YouTube channel. We will share a brief survey, a resource list, and a copy of this recording after the webinar. My name is Linda Stewart, and I am one of the co-hosts of the webinar and research team member at the AFS project. At AFS, I direct our global education innovation efforts, including the Global Up program, and was a key initiator of virtual exchange launched within the last 2 years. I'm happy to be here with you today, joining you from my home in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I am joined by co-host Henry Shepard, Assistant Director of the Stevens Initiative, who among many endeavors leads his team on the institution's commitment to strengthening the field of virtual exchange through catalyzing and sponsoring research. Henry is based in New York.
Hi there, can you all hear me today?
We can hear you just great.
Great, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Henry. Next, I'd like to introduce our guest research speakers, Dr. Corinna Howland, who served as the lead researcher on this project. Dr. Howland is an anthropologist who received her PhD from the University of Cambridge in September of 2020. She has worked with AFS previously on researching global competence in teacher education. She currently teaches at the Victorian University of Wellington in New Zealand. Welcome, Dr. Howland.
It's a pleasure to be with you all today. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And next we have Dr. Betsy Hansel, who served as the senior advisor on this project. Dr. Hansel is a researcher with over 30 years experience conducting institutional and educational research at AFS from 1980 to 2009. She also served as the institutional research director at the Borough Manhattan Community College. Fun fact, Betsy just released her 3rd edition of the Exchange Student Survival Kit, advice for your international exchange experience. Welcome, Betsy.
Thank you, Linda. It's good to be here.
And I'm also joined by my colleague, Anaïs Chevet, who played an essential role as a research assistant, both registering and tracking down all of the virtual exchange participants. Anaïs is here today supporting us from her home in France. Today, we will hear more about what exactly is virtual exchange and the role of the Stevens Initiative, what it plays in research projects. We will share more about the AFS Global U Adventurer program, which is the virtual exchange that was served as the intervention in this particular study. Not a lot of research is out there for K-12 and virtual exchange. So I encourage you to stick with us today to hear the what, the how, the why, and of course, the key findings from this study and the future implications it has. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Henry, who will share more about Stevens and their commitment to the field of virtual exchange.
Thanks so much, Linda, and thanks again for hosting this webinar with us today. We are just so thrilled about this research project and to see it get to this stage. So I'll say a little bit first about the Stevens Initiative, and then I will talk more about virtual exchange and why it's so important. And if you can hear my dog barking in the background, I promise he hasn't been barking all afternoon and just must have heard something outside. The Stevens Initiative is a lasting tribute to the legacy of Ambassador J. Christopher Stevens, who devoted his life to building bridges between cultures. The initiative is sponsored by the U.S. Department of State, with funding provided by the U.S. government, and is administered by the Aspen Institute. Additional funding is provided by the Bezos Family Foundation and the governments of Morocco and the United Arab Emirates. We have hopefully a broad and expansive understanding of what virtual exchange is. And I think it's important to lay out a few of the principles we keep in mind when we think of most virtual exchange programs and when we think about the scope of our work. We view virtual exchange as programs that use technology to connect people for education and exchange. They mainly serve young people, broadly defined. They connect participants in different countries or different places, often with a strong intercultural dimension. And they often help participants gain global competencies, among other knowledge, skills, and abilities. When we think about why virtual exchange is so important, and I think much of this has been driven home significantly during the pandemic, we think this is a really important way to expand access to affordable, meaningful international experiences for far more people than have access to international learning through in-person means. We think we can reach younger audiences, people who might not be ready to travel yet, and many other groups besides who aren't able to travel or study abroad for a whole host of reasons. We think that virtual exchange uniquely gives people the opportunity to practice their technology skills, communication and collaboration skills in a medium that all of us now use, or so many of us now use for our work and for other forms of engagement. We think virtual exchange can help advance learning in many different subject areas, from the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math, to the social sciences, international relations, and many other fields as well. And as we've seen over the past few years, virtual exchange is possible even when in-person gathering and in-person travel are not possible, such as during the pandemic. These are all factors that make virtual exchange indispensable. And the Stevens Initiative tries to build the virtual exchange field through a variety of means, including grant making and advocacy and knowledge building. And so we have been investing in research projects that try to fill important gaps in knowledge in the field. Linda mentioned a moment ago that there really isn't that much out there yet about virtual exchange for primary or secondary students. There are several other knowledge gaps we've tried to address as well through research projects over the past year, and we've actually issued another call for proposals that's open right now. You can learn more about our work on our website, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to delve more into this at the end of the session. Thanks so much for having me.
Great. Thank you so much, Henry. And thanks again to the Stevens Initiative, because obviously without their support, this research project would not have been possible for AFS. Many of you are familiar with AFS, but just in brief, AFS is an international voluntary non-governmental education organization that was founded in 1914. We provide intercultural learning opportunities to help people develop the knowledge, skills, and understanding needed to create a more just and peaceful world. We started with our first exchange program in 1947. We are headquartered in New York City with partner organizations in 55 countries that all work together towards achieving that same mission. AFS measures its success by how well it develops global citizens, globalizes schools and institutions, and expands access to intercultural education. One way we expand access is through our Global U Adventurer program. The GYA, as it's called, is global in nature, with multilateral cohorts taking place outside of the traditional classroom setting in a non-formal secondary capacity. This virtual exchange, also known as the intervention used in this study, includes a series of online modules with videos subtitled in English and Spanish, an online forum for collecting and reflecting with global peers, 4 live dialogue sessions run by qualified facilitators on Zoom, interactive quizzes and assignments, a handbook to download and take away, as well as 16 hours of connections spanning 5 weeks. The curriculum includes topics such as social identity, stereotypes, generalizations, communication styles, conflict resolution, empathy and active listening, inequalities and microaggression. When we compare this to other virtual exchange programs included in the Stevens Initiative typography report, we create a programmatic profile that shows typical demographics, the technology that's used, the activities presented, and any certifications that are earned. Supporting this approach is also the OECD's latest PISA report, which focused on 15-year-olds worldwide identifying global competence education as necessary for students to thrive in an interconnected world. The PISA report specifically highlights virtual exchange as potentially an effective way to foster positive intercultural dispositions among students. So let's take a minute to pause and hear directly from those students.
It was a unique experience for me.
Talking to people from different countries.
I found out so many things I never knew.
Throughout the certificate, I learned a lot about myself, like why I communicate the way I do or why I feel more comfortable in certain settings.
The modules really were amazing and helpful. It taught me about empathy.
I learned a lot about myself and others.
I learned how to be open-minded.
I could learn, fail, and explore a lot of things.
To be genuinely interested in others.
In the live sessions, it was really interesting for me.
I learned about people from places that I haven't ever been to before, or places that I haven't ever met anyone from before.
To connect with people from all around the world that are my age, that are going through the exact same things that I'm going through.
I realized that I'm not alone. There are a lot of students feeling like me.
And I feel like, oh, it's normal. I'm not walking alone in this pathway, you know.
It felt like I kept getting to meet new people and share my culture and learn about other people's cultures.
It helps a lot to meet new people.
And we could all relate to each other and talk about how our experiences were so different, yet so similar at the same time.
And bridging those gaps and reminding ourselves that we seriously are a lot more alike.
I developed my global awareness by doing these sessions.
I feel so great.
It was especially interesting reading through the comments.
Because I was able to read opinions.
Made me ask questions I never really asked myself before.
Stereotypes and generalizations and microaggression. There was a lot of topics which I did not think about before I started.
How to better handle different situations like conflict.
And is a very good source to acquire skills that aren't taught in school.
I'm really glad I did this program.
And I just can't wait to take all the things that I learned on this program with me into the future.
In my studies, or maybe in my international business companies.
There's a whole world out there that I haven't met yet.
I'm really looking forward to continue my intercultural journey.
I really want to discover more and learn more.
In order to understand cultures around the world better, in order to understand myself.
Bridge better to other people, and I think that's really important.
Even though we're really different,
everybody needs respect and everybody needs to be treated equally.
At the end, we can all be friends.
I'm sure I'm gonna remember it for the rest of my life.
Really forever, for the rest of my life.
It was a very wonderful program, thanks to the whole AFS organization.
Thank you for making me who I am right now.
I really now see myself as a global citizen.
Together, we will make a better world.
Thank you so much, Anais. So as you can see and hear, the students' testimonies are extremely positive and compelling. At AFS, however, we wanted to take it to the next level of rigor and test if they did indeed grow their global competence, their self-awareness, if they built more empathy, developed stronger perspective-taking skills, and improved their intercultural communications. So with that, I'll turn it over to our expert research team to walk us through the findings. Dr. Howland.
Thanks very much, Linda. Excuse me. So when we were looking and formulating our research questions for this project, we looked at the literature on virtual exchange and noted that there was only very limited engagement with youth. Most analyses of exchange programs in general and virtual exchange programs in particular focus on the development of global competence in adult and young adult participants. So because we don't yet have a clear picture of how youth global competence development in virtual exchange, we were particularly interested in exploring this question with our 14 to 17-year-old research cohort. Because we realized that we can't necessarily assume that what's true of adult and young adult learners is also true of high school students. So that was really what formulated our first question: does virtual exchange develop core elements of youth global competence? And then we were also interested in the second question of dosage, which is that we wanted to know if more time spent in the program would enhance the development of youth global competence, with a view to making recommendations on program length and composition. So those were our research questions. We were very lucky to get together a varied research cohort through Linda and Anais's significant efforts, recruited from existing GYA program registrants and via social media. And this ensured that both the cohort and the GYA participant group already had some interest in AFS's virtual exchanges, which we thought was an important factor in influencing their results. So unfortunately, as with many research projects, and especially online research, we had a few issues with control group retention over the course of the project. Not all of our cohort group completed both surveys, which we wanted to account for any baseline fluctuation in people's responses over time, knowing that people are variable, that different days may yield different responses to the same question. So we wanted to make sure that we controlled for that. However, although the cohort numbers might be a tiny bit smaller than we would have liked, we were really happy with how the research cohorts were matched as a whole in terms of their demographic variables, such as language use, such as gender, and the global spread of the research participants. So in terms of methodology, we chose a mixed method approach, which was particularly useful in terms of generating comprehensive data and ensuring participants' voices and experiences formed a core part of our research. So we used pre and program assessment with 2 survey instruments, the Intercultural Effectiveness Scale and the Stevens Initiative Common Survey Questions from groups B and C, which I'll speak to in just a moment. But we were also, in terms of the qualitative side of the analysis, we were interested in understanding our participants in their own words and on their own terms, which is why we included that qualitative component as well. So what we did in terms of the qualitative side was that we observed some of the students' facilitated dialogue sessions to get a sense of how participants engaged one another in the shared space. And we also conducted a thematic analysis of the postings that students made in the online forums in response to reflective questions given in each module, which generated a very significant amount of data, 4,204 postings in total. So for the purposes of this preliminary study, we have used the qualitative data to further investigate our qualitative findings. So you'll see that a little bit more as we go through. So a little bit more on the 2 survey instruments. So we used the Intercultural Effectiveness Scale, which is run by the COSI group. And we were particularly interested in using this scale because our 14 to 17-year-old research cohort needed plain language in the questions, survey questions that they were being asked. So we found that this was more accessible for our teenage participants. And we used the second instrument was that some of the items from the Stevens Initiative Common Survey items, groups B and C. And these were particularly helpful for us to get a sense of how participants changed their reflections and their perceptions of their learning over the course of the GYA program. So it offered participants the opportunity to reflect on their behavior and how their behaviors had changed after their engagement with the program. So it was a really interesting set of survey questions for us. So what I'll do now is hand over to Betsy, who will talk us through some of the findings.
Great, thank you very much. We have to think, what do we mean by measuring global competence? Well, first, we have to have the IES. We're going to first work on the IES data, in which the responses have been shown by others to relate to specific types of skills and attitudes needed for working with and relating to people from other cultural backgrounds. We have data from these surveys before and after the GYA program, as Corinna has mentioned, and for the participants, as well as a small number in the control group. So we'll start with the IES scores and how we're measuring simple growth. So when you see this in this chart, we have calculated the simple growth computing, subtracting the pre-test score from the post-test score, which is just very easy to do, and for each person. So a person here who has a lower score in the post-test shows up as negative growth, and those who are showing positive growth here have had an improvement between the pre and the post-test to the extent shown here. We have each of the subscales here. The blue is the GYA participants, and the gray is the control group. So if we take a look at the box on the right, you can see that we've identified 3 scales in which the overall IES rating, the positive regard scale, and the self-awareness scale, where the differences between the GYA participants and the control group showed the most significance. This means that we had more than 99% certainty that our results are not just from random chance and for these items. 4 other scales, hardiness, world orientation, interpersonal engagement, and continuous learning. In these, we can also be confident that the GYA participants had more growth, although at a lower level of significance, i.e. 95% or better rather than 99% or better. So if you're just looking at the chart, you may wonder, why does the significance not seem to relate to the length of the lines that you're seeing there? And we're going to take one example, the world orientation, where the GYA participants showed the most growth, and try to explain what's going on. So here you can see when we actually compared the pretest scores of the participants in the control group, we were rather surprised to find that the control group had a significantly higher pretest score in this variable than the GYA participants. And in the post-test, they continued to show a higher level in world orientation than the AFS GYA participants, but they showed very little growth. And if you look at the AFS group, you can clearly see that they started at a much lower point and grew quite significantly. So the small size of the control group makes it sometimes difficult to be totally certain, but in this case, the statistics were very clear that the GYA participant growth was significantly greater than that of the control group. So the other thing that we discovered, or maybe it wasn't so surprising, is why does a high pretest score relate negatively to the growth on this scale? When we looked at this kind of it's a typical Likert scale. I just have an example of one found on the web with 5 options. The scoring presents some measurement problems. Sometimes people will use the score with the middle category of no opinion or somewhat agree and somewhat disagree as 0, and use +1 and +2 for somewhat agree and strongly agree, and -1 and -2 for the disagree items. The scoring we chose was simply to mark strongly disagree as 1 and strongly agree as 5, and 3 as the midpoint. We also reversed the scale for a few Stevens items where the strongly disagree was actually the most positive option for the students to select. But no matter how you score these survey items, there are absolute limits at the top and the bottom of the scale. And the hypothetical participant who selected strongly agree to a positive statement in the pretest on some given item will not show any improvement when presented with the same item again at the post-test and still strongly agreeing. So whatever improved understanding the participant might have had related to this concept is simply not going to show up as growth. And this is one of the problems that we uncovered. And at the same time, you take another participant who somewhat disagrees in the pretest, that this student or this participant now has the option to improve 3 points on this kind of scale, or if they strongly disagree, they have at least the theoretical possibility of improving 4 points. So this pretest score was a particular problem that we wanted to address. So we wanted to also, when we're thinking the pretest score affects the outcome, we also thought there might be some other factors that might lead to growth. So we used logistic regression modeling to try to determine what factors would influence growth in the variables that we were interested in. Logistic regression calculates how much the odds of achieving the desired outcome are changed by each of the factors that are shown to be significantly affecting the outcome. Our model is based on a simple outcome, either growth or no growth in each of the scales. We wanted to know how much participants in the GYA, how much participating in the GYA program predicts growth on each scale compared to the control group, after we accounted for the impact of these other factors, which would include the pretest score, which we knew could restrict growth. But we also wanted to consider the participants' gender, English fluency, parents' educational level, and thinking that these might in some way influence the outcome for the students. We also asked them to indicate if any of their 5 closest friends included someone from a different cultural background than their own. So these were some of the things that we were considering and using in our study. We found, as a result, that the pretest score was actually very predictive of growth, in many cases more so than participating in GYA. But gender, parental education levels, self-rated English fluency were not found to be predictors of any of the outcomes. However, having 1 or more friends from another culture was significant in the overall IES score, but not for any of the subscales. So we look now particularly at the individual scales. The overall IES scale is shown here. The logistic regression modeling correctly predicted about the growth outcome for 70% of our total sample of GYA participants and the control group. This is a substantial improvement over what would have been found in a model that looked only at the distribution of growth and no growth outcomes. It's never really possible to identify and include all the factors that influence learning or growth in an individual case. But our model for growth in the overall IES scale found 3 factors significantly predict growth with our sample and data. And this slide shows how the odds of growth improve or decline based on these 3 items. GYA participation, of course, is the one that we were most interested in. And for those who participated in the GYA program, they had nearly 3 times the odds of growing on the IES scale compared to those in the control group. This means that for every control group member who might grow, we would expect nearly 3 GYA participants to grow. And this is after controlling for the pretest score and the factor of having friends from another culture. The pretest score, for every point on the pretest score that the students had, their odds of showing growth were 77% lower. And for students who had indicated that in their first survey that at least one of their best friends, 5 best friends, was from another culture, those students had overall lower odds of growing too than for students who did not have friends from another culture. So I want to hand this now over to Corinna to talk about the qualitative part.
That's great. Thank you very much, Betsy. So what I'd like to do now is to walk you all through some of the subscales or the specific attitudes, skills, and behaviors where GYA participants showed the most growth, and to link that to some of the qualitative findings. So the first is growth in positive regard, which under the IES scale is defined as the degree to which one withholds judgments about situations or people that are new or unfamiliar. So our findings here were really significant, demonstrating that GYA participation is significantly predictive of growth in positive regard, which is for us a really exciting finding. They showed nearly 3 times greater odds of growth in positive regard compared to the control group, whereas obviously they decline by 76% for every point on the pretest score. So we suggest that this significant result can be attributed to high levels of reinforcement of positive regard in the GYA program as a whole. So 6 out of the 20 modules that the GYA participants experience are explicitly tailored to reinforcing positive regard. So these are modules with titles like Stereotypes and Generalizations, When Differences Collide, Suspending Judgment. And a further 3 of the modules implicitly address this dimension of global competence. So this, for us, demonstrated how focusing on a particular aspect of global competence can yield significantly positive results. And this finding is also reinforced by the qualitative data, where being open-minded and avoiding judgment was rated the second most important learning outcome from the program as a whole, suggesting that students particularly valued this aspect of the course material. You can see this in their responses. So for example, participant A notes, I've learned how important it is to be open-minded and excited about new and different cultures, and also how stereotypes affect negatively people's lives. Whereas participant K writes, I think the most important thing I learned was how to be a good listener. The program teaches us to suspend judgment, to listen to the person speaking, rather than inserting ourselves before we get the full picture. I think this skill is important. So a second scale where we noted growth was in the area of relationship development, which is the extent to which one is likely to initiate and maintain positive relationships with people from other cultures. So in this area, our findings were on the cusp of statistical significance for growth, with an almost 94% certainty. However, lower pretest scores are more predictive of positive results here. So the pretest score is over 99.9% certain. But nevertheless, this for us was a particularly surprising finding, as the GYA program offers fewer opportunities for relationship development than other types of exchanges. Over half of the program is asynchronous content, so content that students complete by themselves. So because of that, we consider this to be an especially meaningful finding. And this is also where the qualitative aspect of the project really helps us to illuminate what was going on for participants in the GYA program. So the qualitative data shows us that students made ample use of the opportunities they had for developing relationships on the GYA program. Most of the students attended all of their qualified facilitation sessions. They enthusiastically participated in tasks designed to facilitate relationship development, such as a conversation in the module on practicing curiosity, which asked students to get to know a program partner from a different cultural background. We also found that relationships developed outside the course. Students were very keen to share their WhatsApp, their Instagram, their social media profiles, and we found that students were connecting regularly on these alongside their formal connections in the qualified facilitation sessions. And so another finding was that almost 80% of our students reported making friends on the program, which potentially exceeded their expectations at the start of the program and demonstrates the capacity for relationship development even within a short program. And finally, we also found that students desired more opportunities to connect with one another. So that was something that came up in the post-program surveys, that they were keen for any opportunity to spend time with their peers on the program, which was an interesting finding for us. So we're now going to speak very briefly to our second research question, which was around the issue of dosage, or do more live sessions matter? So in order to modify people's engagement with the program within the constraints that we had available to us at the time, we offered 2 of our 6 participant cohorts additional facilitated dialogue sessions, which extended their program from 5 to 6 weeks. So they were taking an additional 3 hours of facilitated dialogue sessions compared to their peers on the program. This was something that, because of the small cohort sizes, we weren't able to pinpoint the significance of differences between the 5 and the 6 week program cohorts as much as we would have liked. However, we did find that interpersonal engagement was significantly higher for the extra dosage cohorts than for the control group, and also higher than the standard dosage cohort, although not significantly so. So these findings demonstrate that there's some suggestion that extra sessions do work to facilitate interpersonal engagement. However, that can only be a tentative conclusion given the small sample sizes that we were working with. But as we've noted, when talking about relationship development as a whole, students valued opportunities to engage with one another and requested increased contact with other program participants through more interactive activities, additional time to get to know their peers, and further facilitated sessions. So they wanted the extra dosage, which was an interesting finding. And so if we were going to conduct further research on dosage in the future, we would need to have larger cohorts, and we would also want to significantly modify the existing program structure. So extend, for example, from 5 to 7 weeks or 5 to 8 weeks to ensure that we can produce statistically significant results and generate a more meaningful comparison on dosage. But they're interesting findings in a preliminary survey. And I'll just give you a little bit, this graph just gives you a little bit of a sense of the variance in interpersonal engagement, the simple growth in IEA scales by group. So the control group is the gray on the left, and you note the significant difference between this simple growth of the control and the extended group, although not as significant as with the regular DYA group taking the standard 5-week program. All right. And so now I want to highlight one final finding which came up very strongly through our use of the Stevens Initiative Groups B and C questions. And this was the retrospective pretest. So these were questions that students were asked, knowing what you know now, having completed the program, think back to before you completed the program and asking students to rate themselves now based on how they had changed between pre and post program. So after answering the initial post-test questions on the Stevens Initiative items, students were given this task of answering them again as they now think they should have rated themselves. And so each of the items that you see on screen showed an average difference of at least half a point between students' self-rated post-test scores and their reassessed retrospective pre-test scores. So how they think they were at the start of the program, and then how they think they should have been at the start of the program based on their post-program evaluation. So what we found here was that questions where students demonstrated the most growth were in areas of communication behavior, whereas students grew less on feelings and attitudes type questions. And this was really intriguing to us. So we speculated that students might have been overconfident in their self-ratings on feelings and attitudes. So, felt very strongly that they were a member of the global citizenry, for example. Whereas in terms of communication behaviors, what we thought was that the GYA program may have allowed participants the opportunity to pay specific attention to how they communicate. And we see this coming through again in the qualitative analysis. So in the post-program survey, for example, students stated that cross-cultural communication was the most valuable thing that they learned from the GYA program, and this was an open set of questions. And also noted that the GYA program provided concrete tools for enhancing their communication behaviors. So for example, the students had a lot of practice with the DIVE tool, which some of you might be familiar with, the describe, interpret, verify, evaluate a situation. Students also, this was something that came up repeatedly in the observations of the facilitated dialogue sessions, was that students experienced spontaneous realizations about their communication. So in one example I witnessed, a student realized that she had been speaking too quickly and using too much slang in her interactions with her peers from other cultures. So she resolved to slow down and to choose her words carefully in future. And we also see this reflected in the statements that people made in the post-program survey that you can see on the screen there. Great. Yeah, so for example, participant L noted that I have learned to function in intercultural environments, to take several things into account before making my own judgment, to communicate correctly, and pay close attention to my actions, gestures, and words. So it's really getting people to think about how they're communicating with others, which was for us a really interesting finding. All right, I'll now hand over to Betsy to wrap up with learning implications.
There we go. So we believe that virtual exchanges can have a meaningful, immediate impact on the development of global competence among high school aged youth around the world. We don't yet know, of course, about the long-term impacts. This is always difficult to measure because in the course of the year, especially for young people in this age group, many changes happen that could also have impacts. However, we could contact the students in another year or some other time frame, and we could then ask to find more about what's going on and to see if they've actually, what do they believe has been the impact for them, because that's probably the best that could be done at this point. Secondly, GYA programs group, particularly on measures of positive regard, relationship development, and cross-cultural communication. These are all very important skills and attitudes for building further intercultural skills. Suspending judgment, being aware of stereotyping, being curious and interested in people from other backgrounds, and of course, developing communication and listening skills can keep these students more engaged with people from other backgrounds, different from their own. The AFS, GYA, and other VE programs, which have similar synchronous-based course structure, may want to ensure that they have as many opportunities as possible for contact among the students incorporated into the activities, including more informal time to chat and form connections. Many of the participants expressed interest in this, and it helps keep the program from being just conceptually based. Intercultural skills are really hands-on and, like language learning, need practice. Finally, we found some evidence that further opportunities for virtual synchronous interaction could enhance growth in interpersonal engagement. We have to make this tentative because our sample size in the group with extended sessions was too small to have certainty here, but it does make sense. So I think I turn this over now. Tips for implementation.
Great. Thank you so much, Betsy and Corinna, to both of you. I think it's interesting when we get that feedback from the students about wanting more time to connect informally. And those are great tips that we get from the student to figure out how we can go ahead and change the design or include other kind of aspects into the program that we offer. So I think what's really key here is that this study has highlighted for us some of the best practices for virtual exchange. And for you as practitioners, you might consider first that you offer a blended learning experience with synchronous and asynchronous learning that is supported by qualified facilitation. Once you've identified your student learning goals, you can intentionally build that into the program design, as has been shared here today, where students did indeed grow their self-awareness, improve their communication, hold positive regard, which is also suspending stereotypes. It's important to leverage the difference that surrounds us in whatever kind of setting you're in, whether it be a formal classroom or a non-formal setting like the GYA, which pulled from co-curricular groups around the world. It's also important to keep the technology varied for different learning preferences. And listen to the students. They want more informal chatting. We'll have to figure out a way to get that for them. I think most importantly is keeping it developmentally appropriate and fun so that we can meet the learners where they are at. We also suggest that you download the Stevens Initiative Typology Report so you can better understand the types of exchanges that exist and how they are created and what is required to implement them. This would be a great resource for you wherever you are on your journey. So I want to just thank Henry and the Stevens Initiative for their sponsorship and their support for the past 9 months. We absolutely could not have done it without you. And many special thanks to Corinna and Betsy for their dedication and expertise on this project. And I want to thank you, the audience, for turning in and joining us today. I know there are some questions in the Q&A. I want to be sure we reserve some time. So first we'll see what is available, what has been asked already on the Q&A. And then if we have a chance after that, you can go ahead and raise your hand and you can unmute. So one of the questions that came through was about the control group. Could you clarify if the control group included young people who had not done any virtual exchange? I can turn it over to Corinna or Betsy if you would like to answer that. Betsy looks like she's going to take it, but you're on mute.
we go. Sorry. I've got too many screens and too many things. We actually did not ask the question. They were people who might in the future take this same GYA course. They were applicants in some cases that would be in the future. It wasn't like nominated best friends. The fact that they scored higher in some of the areas that surprised us suggests that they're a similar audience, but it doesn't, we don't know what their background is in terms of future or previous virtual exchange.
I mean, one thing we can assure is that they were not on the GYA during the time of the study. And in some instances, they were incentivized to finish the control, where we would offer them a small discount on a future virtual exchange program with AFS, if they were so interested. One thing we did also incentivize the control students with was a copy of their IES results. So the IES, in addition to being an assessment, is just a really great guide on areas of your global competence that you can work on. And so for any student who was in the control and took the pre and the post, we offered up their IES profile to them at the end. There's another question about handling the time zone issues related to the live session. I might throw that back to you, Dr. Howland, because I know you did have a chance to join in on some of the live sessions and maybe just get your impressions, and then I can tell you what we did from a programmatic side on the AFS.
Thanks very much, Linda, and thank you for the question. It is an interesting one. I mean, I was observing some of the facilitated dialogue sessions and joining from New Zealand, which is obviously the most inconvenient time zone for everybody else. But students were actually, one thing that I noticed was that students were very committed to meeting those sessions as best they could. So, for example, had students who were joining after midnight in order to attend their session. And also students who, even though they had often had two opportunities for different sessions that would accommodate for their time zones, but students, once they'd formed connections from that initial group, they often wanted to stay in it even if the time zone wasn't the most convenient for them. So that was something that I found really interesting.
This was no small task undertaken by Anais, who, before individuals registered, we did ask them to click a box saying that they understood that this was a global endeavor and that people would likely be calling in to the live sessions from multiple time zones. The one thing we did find out is that we had 5 cohorts in total, and if one of the cohorts did have that 24-hour span of time zones, we did end up setting up 2 different facilitated dialogue sessions for that cohort. So it is possible that some of the students in cohort 2 may not have met all of the participants live. But what we always did is that we kept the session open. So even if you attended the dialogue session 2 with people in your time zone area and wanted to meet the rest of the students, even though you could see all of their interactions online, you could also attend that second session. So exactly how many students did that, I don't have that data on hand, but that was a possibility. We have another question around students, teenagers that may have mild cognitive difficulties. So the question here is if we've considered any possibilities to make adaptations to facilitate participation of students with mild cognitive difficulties. I'll just say a couple words about that, and I'm going to turn it over to Henry to see if Stevens has any ideas about best practices. What I can say from the AFS GYA side is that because we do keep the interactions quite varied, with there being time for self-reflection, online forums where students can write in and respond and reread. We also have the videos and the lecturettes can be sped up, slowed down, multiple subtitles included. And those were some of the considerations that we included for the program. We also did some pair share. So for students who were more comfortable maybe talking with one other student, they had a way to meet each other and interview each other as well. Henry, any suggestions from the Stevens side?
I want to start by acknowledging that a lot of the challenges or impediments that face people with differences or limits on their access in the physical space are things that absolutely recreated, if not worsened, online. And we can't assume that because of technology, holds the promise of expanding access and including people, that it necessarily is going to work like that, because we bring so much baggage into these spaces. And so I think it's important to say that many programs don't do as much on this score as they might hope at the start, or as they might think they do. And that is in no way an indictment of what you all are doing at all. It's just to say that we don't want to prematurely claim success at expanding access when I know it's a real challenge. There have been some programs we've worked with that have worked on expanding access to specific groups. There have been programs we've worked with that have talked about the ways that people with different work styles or developmental differences might be able to participate on terms that feel appropriate and comfortable for them, but they're really specific to the communities that they serve. And I think it really just starts with, who are you designing the program for and with, and are you working with them to make sure that it's built from the ground up to be about what those people want and need and what they like to use, and then working closely with them throughout the process. So there's very little I can say aside from talking about the urgency of listening and working carefully, and not assuming that the technology is going to bail you out. That's what I would say.
Thanks, Henry. I noticed that there was one participant in the audience that had her hand raised. Catherine, if you're still there and you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question, you're welcome to do so. We might have lost her. Okay. Here comes another question from Mattia. Will you compare these data with a physical pupil exchange group? I suppose I have to answer that. Go ahead, Curdy, you were going to say something.
Oh, no, I just think that it would be a really interesting future area for development. And obviously, Linda will, I assume, speak to this in a minute, but obviously because AFS spans both virtual and physical exchange programs, there is definitely the capacity to do that in the future.
Yeah. Exactly. There is the capacity to do that. And because we have also used this instrumentation, the IES, before, we also have some colleagues on right now in the audience who are sharing in the chat that they will be using the IES pre and post in another virtual exchange. But it is likely that we will go ahead and do some sort of comparative study in the future. We may have a problem with unmuting. I know Will Brown has raised his hand, but Will, go ahead and unmute if you can. I'm not sure. Let me try to see if I can. Yeah, unfortunately, I think I think I can. Go ahead. Will, go ahead.
Unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Aloha. As you know, I'm a returnee from 1957 summer program Germany. 64 years ago, I was an AFS student. Betsy, I think I know you from years gone by in New York. I was the consulting physician at AFS.
You were Dr. Brown. Oh, okay. Yes.
I am still Dr. Brown, and I'm living with my partner of 17 years in Honolulu right now. The question I raise is, having become a part of the virtual world late in my life, I didn't have a Dropbox till I was 74. And now this new tool is available to us. How do people of us like me, who are seniors who've seen AFS grow from its very earliest days, participate in this at this point? It amazes me. I sit here with my cell phone, I push one button, and on the other end, the voice says, Zungen. It's my AFS sister in Heidelberg, Germany. It's quite incredible, but I want to be a part of it and still participate. I see Henry smiling. It keeps me young.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. I think that's an excellent suggestion and one that we will definitely keep in mind as far as how we can get alumni, past, included in these virtual exchange opportunities, because why not, right? There are many of us that have been on our mobility programs, and we need to have a virtual exchange for the adults as well. So thank you for your comment.
Virtual or otherwise. I mean, I've got a long history. Betsy knows some of it because I was at AFS Intercultural for 25 years when I was living in New York, and my late former wife was returning. My daughter is a returnee who's now 48 with a son of her own. So this generation keeps going on. And I want to keep that part of our richness and diversity alive as best we all can.
I will say
I have two college classmates who are returnees, one from Pakistan from that summer and another one from Germany. And we're still in touch and we talk about our AFS experiences. And one is a surgeon in Iowa and another one is a housewife in St. Paul, Minnesota. And we all were AFSers 64 years ago. Huh. Enough. Mahalo nui, thank you. Malama pono, take care. Ahoy ho. Until later. I'm learning Hawaiian at this stage of the game.
A lot of the champions of virtual exchange are people who have been trailblazers in in-person exchange. And I think there's absolutely a role for multi-generational connections and collaborations and exchanges and dialogues within countries, across countries. Clearly, organizations such as AFS that have such an incredible and global alumni and volunteer and staff network have an enormous strength to build on when it comes to finding new ways to help people do things virtually that they feel compelled to do. That's what we've just heard. It's really wonderful.
Feel free to reach out and be in contact. Linda, Betsy, people I'm sure know how to reach me out here in Honolulu. Believe it, talk about being in New Zealand. Well, Hawaii is in the middle of the Pacific too. It's all fine. Aloha no.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. You've definitely started a movement here. I can follow on the chat that there are lots of fans to starting this alumni and even some programs for elders is a fantastic idea. That was somebody else's words, not mine. Okay, so one final question before we wrap up, and that comes from our colleague Fran, who's wondering if we saw there was an increase in access to students in more remote locations when virtual. It's an area of interest and potential that she's working on with her organization in Australia. And what I can say about accessibility, first of all, there's certainly what is a big difference between the price of a mobility program and the price of a virtual exchange program. And in this particular instance, we were able to have almost half of our participants receive some sort of financial assistance or some sort of scholarship. So that increased accessibility, as well as we had a lot of students who indicated to us, students and parents alike, that while mobility and having some in-person exchange was on the radar for them in the future, this provided a way to try it out, sample it, see if it was for them. And it also felt a lot more safe and accessible during the global pandemic. So for many people, they still do remain sheltered in place or with limited access. And this provided a way for people to not feel that interruption so strongly about connecting with global peers, but be able to do it in this intentional way. And so for that, they were very grateful. I can just also say briefly on behalf of AFS that we don't think virtual is going to go away anytime because of the success that we're seeing, the interest, and the fact that we can reach more people. And if anything, we're hoping to see our track of both exchange in person and virtual go like this in the near future. So I think with that, we are at time. Were there any other questions or comments before we thank everybody?
I want to acknowledge my colleague Kyle Kassler, who's done a phenomenal job connecting the Stevens Initiative and all 7 of our research projects. I think he's here today, and I just wanted to say how incredibly grateful we all are for the stewardship and leadership that he's provided. So thank you, Kyle, for all of that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So we're just going to throw up a quick slide at the end to let you know about a couple other activities for the rest of this week. AFS will be joining the Stevens Initiative again on Wednesday when you release your virtual exchange field report. So thank you very much for including AFS in that. And we look forward to hearing from a lot of other exchange organizations and virtual exchange projects that you have. Also on Wednesday, later that day, AFS will be co-hosting a webinar with Education New Zealand on making global citizenship a national priority. So please do join in at that time if you can. And then this whole week, actually, the Instituto Now, which I think is based in Switzerland, is running a week-long what can virtual exchange look like? So we will be sending you the link to the registrations for all of these, and we do encourage you to join us. And then if you need to get in touch with us, here's where you can find us. As I mentioned before, we will be sending out a resource page along with a copy of the recording of this. And stay tuned. We hope that in early 2022, our research project will be coming out either in the form of a white paper or in a publication. But in the meantime, we are very grateful to all of you for joining us as we share our preliminary results and get as excited as we can about virtual exchange. So thank you, Henry and Kyle, Corinna, Betsy, and Anais. And Dr. Brown, you're still on my screen, so thank you very much. Thank you all and have a wonderful day, evening, good night.
Good night.